While we're waiting for peeps to log in, why don't you post in the chat where you're located? New Jersey, Minnesota. Okay, well, let's get started. So welcome to the SADS Foundation webinar in our Living with SADS series. Tonight's topic is participating in research and clinical trials by Cardurion Pharmaceuticals. I'm Marcia Baker, the program director for the SADS Foundation. Cardurion Pharmaceuticals is a Boston-based clinical stage cardiovascular biotechnology company and developing novel next-generation therapeutics for the treatment of heart failure and cardiovascular diseases, including rare arrhythmia disorders. So thank you to our community of families who've joined us tonight for this SADS Foundation webinar. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers from Cardurion Pharmaceuticals, Dr. Pirouz Shamszad, Dr. Liz Moore, and Dr. Hilary McKellar. So we're honored that these Cardurion Pharma professionals are volunteering their expertise and time with us tonight to educate us about clinical trials. So thank you, Pirouz, Liz, and Hilary. We'll have a question and answer session following the presentation that Pirouz will moderate for us. You may type your question in the chat anytime, and these will be addressed after the presentation. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Pirouz Shamszad to get us started.
Thanks so much, Marcia. So as Marcia said, my name is Pirouz. I'm joined by my colleagues, Hilary and Liz. And maybe before we get started, I'll give a quick introduction as to who we are. So you heard about our company, but who we are. So I'm Pirouz. I'm a pediatric cardiologist by training in the cardiac ICU. I did my training in Texas for anyone down in Houston. Then was in Cincinnati where Liz and I met each other. So we go a little way back to the bedside. And then I joined into the pharmaceutical industry roughly about 10 years ago. I still have academic roots at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, where I do my own personal academic research. And then I maintain, my day job, if you will, developing new pharmaceutical drugs for cardiovascular diseases and how I ended up here. Liz, I don't know if you want to kick a quick introduction of who you are.
Sure. I'm Liz Moore, and I'm a nurse practitioner by training. My entire career as a clinician was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where I was in the cardiac ICU. And I went into the research about, 7 years ago now. It doesn't seem possible. And it's all been in cardiovascular research, rare disease, and pediatric research. So I'm very happy to have joined the Cardurion team a few months back and happy to talk to you all today. Hilary?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Hilary McKellar. I'm in the clinical operations side of the pharmaceutical industry. So I've been in the industry for 20 plus years. On the sponsor side, working in pharmaceutical companies, both large and small and everything in between, but really enjoy the small startup space where Cardurion really is at the moment. So thrilled to be a part of the Cardurion team and to share some insights with you here this evening about clinical research. So thanks for having us.
Thank you both. So I think for tonight, what we wanted to go through kind of in three parts was to kind of focus on each of our own little specialties, right? So I'll start off by talking about what are clinical trials and how, as a drug developer, someone who, between making the drug, our chemists and biologists who design the chemical or the molecules or the proteins, basically all the steps leading up to bringing them to humans, putting them into clinical trials, and bringing those drugs to market, approval via FDA or some other regulatory agency. And so as a drug developer, what are clinical trials? What do they mean to me? And how do I use them to bring new pharmaceuticals to patients and to the market? From there, we'll switch over, I think, to probably the most important aspect is while we're in clinical trials and we're researching new drugs, safety is always paramount, making sure that every participant, whoever decides to participate in clinical trials, is protected and safe. And Liz will manage that section. And then I think the more equally important part is, what does it mean to be in a clinical trial? And that's where the operational expertise of Hillary will shine, where she will begin to walk through what the essence of going into a trial to exiting the trial and all the things in between that go into sort of the day-to-day. So I think I'll start off with the basics. I think two things. Number one, the whole talk is framed around the National Institutes Health sort of learn page of clinical trials. And so did this purposefully, that way, if you follow the link, you can sort of read how NIH approaches clinical trials and then perhaps recall this conversation or these slides and kind of put two and two should you be faced with the decision to participate in a clinical trial. And then the second link is where all clinical trials are posted. Now, most clinical trials, I should say. Not every clinical trial that's performed in the United States has to be posted. There's guidelines to which ones are, which ones aren't. But most, and I'll explain this in a second, phase 2, 3, or 4 trials are posted. And so if you wanted to know more about a clinical trial, you can view this government webpage. And this is, I think, an important link to remember. So I put these in the beginning of the deck. Before I start, I'm not sure if there's a way to break mute or maybe in chat, but has anyone here participated in trial or been offered to participate in a trial and was hesitant to do so? Or if so, if you're willing to share your story, I'm not sure, Marsha, if they can come off mute or not, or if we can have that dialogue.
They certainly can come off mute, not a problem.
Yeah, so if anyone is willing, I'll pause here for a second. Unless everyone's shy, I'll just move forward. Already, I'll move forward. So we'll assume that maybe clinical trials you haven't been on them. So I'll kind of start from the beginning and define what is a clinical trial. And as you read on the screen, I'll kind of go word for word. Research involving human volunteers. Everyone signs up to do trials. You're not forced into trials. So volunteers, call them participants, that answers a question designed to add medical knowledge. Again, what's important here is when we talk about clinical trials, we're talking about clinical, human. There are other trials that occur either during or before clinical trials that are called non-clinical trials. Those are clinical, you think of more science experiments where you're looking at animals or cells, something like in vitro and test tubes and all the beakers, crazy scientists. That's where you go into the non-clinical world. It's a very different world than what we're talking about. We're specifically talking about trials that are conducted in humans, after the non-clinical work is initially done. There's two main types of trials. There's interventional trials and observational trials. Interventional, as the name suggests, is based on an intervention. Participants enter the study and a specific therapy and intervention is given. And that is either a therapeutic intervention, a medicine, a procedure, a device, a diagnostic intervention, if you're trying to improve the diagnosis with some sort of genetic screening assay or some laboratory assay, or if there's some quality of life measure, something. But there's something that's different than what was done yesterday to what the trial is trying to do today. And that you're looking for differences between the two. That's different than an observational trial. An observational trial is simply you sign up, you come into the trial, and people monitor you. Now, it may not be exactly the same as how your doctor would normally monitor you. There'd be scheduled visits and scheduled lab checks or scheduled assessments of various, maybe physical exams. But there's data that they're gathering from you and your condition over time to describe either an outcome, to describe a quality of life measure, but something that hasn't been described in that condition before. And that's observational. For the purpose of tonight, we're going to focus on interventional clinical trials. To go more beyond that, it becomes quite complicated, first of all, because there's all sorts of different ways. But more importantly, I think what matters to people is, hey, I've been asked to consider this trial. There's a need for a new drug, a new device. and it's supposed to help this condition, where current medications may not help me as well. And so those are the very traditional interventional clinical trial and the topic for tonight. Before I get too much into why we do trials, I think, and I mentioned phase one, the phases of clinical trials, I think it's important to understand the sequence of clinical trials. And when you are proposed or invited to consider trial, where in drug development, how far along the process is that drug and where is it? And this will give you a good sense, hopefully, of, how much do we know about the drug and where am I getting involved in the process? Phase one is a very early study. And it's sometimes actually the very first time a drug is used in humans. We call that first in human. It's just left the non-clinical world where we've tested safety in animals. We've tested effect in cells or in test tubes, but we have not seen the effect or the safety in humans. This is typically done in very specific centers. They're called clinical pharmacology units. These are not your typical doctor or a typical hospital. These are designed units where people are closely monitored on these drugs to make sure that their safety is monitored and the effect of the drug is monitored. We're looking at the safety of the drug and the dosage of the drug and making sure that the drug is interacting with the body the way we think that the chemistry and the biology should. And typically, this is with healthy volunteers. Some diseases, we can't get that information from healthy volunteers. And so there are some diseases or conditions where a first in human study is performed in a condition, but most times it's in healthy volunteers. And so most studies that a person with a lifelong disease or an intermittent disease would be approached with would be something like a phase 2, 3, or 4 study, but phase ones are possible. Phase 2, follow phase 1. It's after you've done this first in human study. We have some idea of how the drug or the device interacts with the body, and we develop some comfort with understanding how to dose the how to dose the drug. And so now our real question becomes, well, does this drug actually treat the condition we designed it to treat? And so we're looking for the effect. Now we begin to look for patients with a specific condition that fits the mechanism or the action of the drug. It's a medium-sized study. There's usually a few hundred patients, but in a rare disease, something like maybe hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or some of the rare channelopathies that we look at, long QT, you're looking at tens of patients, 10, 20, 30, 40, nothing much more than that because there aren't that many patients to begin with. As we develop that understanding of the effect, we have more and more understanding of the safety. We work with regulatory authorities. I'll explain that in a second. And we go into phase 3. Phase 3 are called pivotal trials. You may hear that term thrown around as well. These are the trials that really look at the effect. We do all the fancy math and statistics to prove that the effect is actually there and not chance. And we make sure that the drug does what it intends to do. And this is what regulators look and double check all our data, check our math, and make sure that this effect is proven prior to filing an application to have this drug approved by the FDA or by EMA or whatever other country we may be in. If we pass that test, we pass that application, the drug is approved, and now your physician can prescribe that medication for you like any other medication you may have heard of before, like penicillin. Phase 4 studies are typically performed after a drug is approved, and these type of studies are more observational in nature. They can be interventional sometimes, but mostly observational. And the goal here is to really look at what the drug does to that condition over time. The other phases are relatively short in duration, about 1 to 2 years, not much longer. Sometimes it takes multiple years for an effect to occur, an outcome to occur. And so these phase 4 studies are a way for us to track, kind of like a natural registry, if you've heard of those before, over time to make sure that the drug has its intended effect over time. So how does a clinical trial work? A clinical trial is based around a protocol. A protocol is a document that, me, Liz, Hillary, all work together to write. And it basically, it's a design, it's a blueprint to how we want to answer a question around the intervention while setting up boundaries to protect the participants in the trial. It specifies how the trial should be conducted, what intervention should be evaluated, the overall design, who can participate in the trial. You'll hear the word eligibility in future slides. That's what that speaks to. How the intervention will be evaluated, when you need to come back to visit your study physician, what sort of assessments, laboratories, physical exam sort of things you must go through as a part of the trial. And it labels out what we're going to do to look for the effect of the drug, as well as look at the safety of the drug. And more importantly, it tells you how long the trial will last so that you have a good sense of how long your commitment to the trial exists. The protocol is absolutely important. The entire study is focused and revolves around that protocol. It governs how everything will run. And so everyone who participates in the clinical trial, me, Liz, Hillary, the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, sometimes it's not just a pharmaceutical company that creates trials. It could be your doctor, your local hospital, community clinic, something, but whoever put that trial together has to abide by it. Doctors, participants, anyone associated with the trial must adhere to the protocol. There's no flexibility in that. There's no going rogue. There's no waivers, as I like to say. That's the technical term is we don't waver from the protocol. We adhere to it 100%. And that's really to promote safety in the clinical trial and make sure that we don't make any mistakes along the way. So some fancy words at the beginning: controlled, randomized, blinded clinical trials are the most common trials. And those terms you may hear in the description of the trial, or your physician may describe those. And so I wanted to take a moment just to explain what that really means and why we design trials that way. So we typically, as I said, an interventional trial, design it to compare one intervention versus another treatment. And we call that a controlled trial. We take a new drug and compare it to either nothing, if there's no other treatment, or an existing treatment, if there is one. That is the control, basically comparing one against the other. Now, sometimes that control could be something called a placebo. It's a sugar pill or salt pill. It has no effect on you. We do this to basically prevent there from being bias or prejudice against the design. It leaves a question of, am I on the drug or not? While it may seem unfair that you want to participate in a clinical trial and you don't receive drug, without having that placebo in the design, it becomes hard to really understand the safety, because sometimes if you take the drug, you may not know if an effect is because of the drug or your condition. This sort of helps take the question out of it, and you just report what you feel and not worry about what you're taking. It lets everything sort of just filter out on its own. And we say it removes bias. It removes that sort of prejudice of, am I taking something new or not? When patients come in, or when participants come into the trial, you don't get to choose what you take, because then that would be bias. And most people would want to take the new treatment in hopes that it may help their condition. We randomly assign people to their treatment arm, the treatment assignment. We call that randomization. Again, it's completely random. A computer will pick for you one or the other, and you'll be assigned. And then we don't necessarily tell you what you're going to take. If absolutely necessary, if there's an emergency or your doctor feels that they need to know what's going on to help your care, by all means, they have access to figuring that out in a moment's time. There's nothing barring them from doing that. But that, in my 10 years, it's never happened before. We call that blinding. And that's really important, again, to preserve. Everything we do here is to try to remove bias, is try to remove that ability for someone to either sway their decision in terms of an effect or sway their decision in terms of safety. We want to try this to be as objective, as neutral as possible, so that the data are scientific, that they stand on their own. And so controlled, randomized, blinded trials, you'll typically hear those when approached about a clinical trial. Now, there are other designs, and they're completely valid. Sometimes you don't want placebo. Sometimes there's a disease that's so harmful or lethal that you don't want them to be on placebo. We've designed plenty of trials called open label. We give you the drug openly. Everyone knows what you're taking, because to do anything else would be unethical. So there's other designs, but majority of the time, controlled, randomized, an RCT trial, right, is what you'll hear about. Who conducts trials? Trials are funded by a sponsor. The sponsor could be many different things. It could be like us, a pharmaceutical company. It could be a medical center. It could be a patient or a voluntary group wanting to do a trial, or a federal agency like the NIH. The source of funding, though, should always be clear to you, so you know who's running the trial and if their interests lie with yours. The clinical trials, though, are run by medical professionals. Most time it's your doctor, someone that that approached you about the trial, or a referring doctor, but medical professionals run trials. We don't run the trial. We oversee the protocol, but we don't run the trial. And so this last bullet point is super important. There are layers of separation between the sponsor and the study staff. Your care is always determined by the medical professionals. Although Liz and I and Hillary may have some medical background, we don't provide your care. And that's important to remember. Your doctor is looking out for your medical best interest and just adhering to the protocol to the point where your medical care overpowers the needs of the protocol. At any point, they'll choose your medical care over the protocol in a heartbeat. And that's really important to remember. And Liz will kind of focus that intersection. So where do we perform trials? Most commonly in your doctor's office. Most times you're going to take a drug at home, come back to the doctor's office back and forth, and it's your doctor. Sometimes it's a referral doctor, same thing, it's an outpatient basis. Sometimes there's community hospital clinics or community clinics where this occurs. Sometimes we do this in academic hospital clinics. Sometimes we do it in the hospital. And sometimes I mentioned some trials require, we do this in very specified clinical research units where there's specific monitoring. Long story short, it's usually in a medical environment with trained medical staff. Almost always it's with trained medical staff. So should not have it be performed in a local mall. Like that's not a valid clinical trial. It will be somewhere legit. So why do we need clinical trials? And this is sort of through my eyes as a drug developer and a pharmaceutical company. It helps not only add knowledge of disease and how to treat and diagnose them, but it helps me bring new drugs to market. It helps me bring new opportunity for treatment to patients. We look for new interventions. We look for new prevention methods. We look for new diagnostic methods. And sometimes, again, like those phase 4 studies, we're looking for different risk factors, quality of life measures, something to help us understand the disease more. Now, why is it important to run clinical trials in drug development? I think first and foremost, unlike my academic work, my work in the pharmaceutical industry is looked over by a million people, right? I'm looking over it, regulators are looking over it, and physicians are looking over it, review boards are looking over it. You're going to hear about all of these terms in the next session. It's really important that you recognize that these clinical trials for new interventions, for unapproved interventions, are externally revealed and regulated at a federal level. And that's really important because this institutes a layer of austerity, right? There is rigor, there is process to this, that we aren't just making up data and running experiments and just sort of, move the decimal point over there. No, this is highly regulated work. And this is the way we make good drugs and bring safe drugs to market. And I think it's adhered to across the board, from all the staff running trials to the sponsors who write them and the regulators who police them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Liz. She'll kind of focus a little bit more on the safety piece. And, I'm happy to take questions after Liz and Hillary get through their section. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Pirouz. So I was very...
Yeah, just let me know when to advance, I'll advance.
Okay. I was very happy to be giving the safety section for today's discussion. As a provider in the hospital, safety was always the #1 priority for the team. But now as a researcher, I know that this priority to conduct studies with safety at the forefront remains. We are compelled, in fact, by the ethical principle of beneficence to do no harm and to maximize the potential benefits of research while minimizing any potential harm to participants. And as you, the participant, are the most important member of any study team, it is our job as sponsors, researchers, and medical providers to ensure safeguards are in place to do just that. So something as important as the safety of study participants, however, cannot be left up to any one individual alone for good reasons. Therefore, clinical studies in humans must be conducted following strict established processes and rules in order to protect your rights, safety, and well-being. So in this section, I'll be walking you through some of the key processes that protect your safety in clinical trials, from preclinical studies and regulatory agencies that Pirouz talked about before, to study medical monitors and physicians. There are many team members, concepts, and required steps in place to assure safety before any individual will enter a study. Next slide. So the ideal way of ensuring patient health in clinical trials is to only progress treatments into human testing that have an acceptable patient safety profile. Influencing the development of new medicines to reduce the potential of having an unacceptable patient safety profile, however, will require a stepwise approach to testing, starting with preclinical studies. So non-clinical studies are those conducted in animals with an investigational drug prior to being administered in humans. And this series of animal studies are designed to test multiple doses, which provide useful data such as what point there are dose-related toxicities that are observed. These data are used to set margins for human dosing, to have put safety monitoring and constraints in place for the early clinical testing. So some adverse events observed in animals will not be acceptable and the drug will never be tested in humans. So that's helpful. But other adverse events, most adverse events that we see will be mild, acceptable, and can be monitored throughout the trial. And they will be moved into humans, these drugs. For example, if the animals are observed to develop a rash during preclinical testing, safety monitoring and management for the development of a rash in humans can be put into place. Preclinical studies have a regulated method in which they must be conducted, depending on the indication and the investigational drug being studied. This includes the number and length of the studies, as well as what doses are going to be used and what animals must be used in that testing. And following completion of the required animal testing, this data will then be presented to the regulatory authorities for review. These regulators, I should say, provide an additional layer of review and oversight and an unbiased examination of the data, again with the lens of safety for when the drug is moved to humans. This preclinical data is also summarized in the investigator's brochure, or IB. The IB is an essential and required study document that is provided to the site investigator, your physician, to make them aware of the outcomes of any previous studies, be it in animals or humans. And this knowledge allows your physician to determine if, number one, the safety profile is acceptable, as well as to anticipate any potential safety issues that have been observed in previous studies. Next slide. So who are these regulatory agencies that Pirouz and I have been referring to along the way? Well, the answer is it depends on what country the research is taking place. In the US, it is the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, that oversees and regulates clinical trials of drugs and devices. The FDA is a federal institution that protects participants throughout the clinical trial process by working closely with researchers to make sure that the trials are safe. And although the FDA is responsible for multiple aspects related to protection of public health, their primary directives all feed back to public safety. So along each step of the journey for the investigational drug, the FDA is there looming, reviewing, providing expert opinion, approving or denying next steps, and most importantly, holding the safety of the patients as their top priority. The FDA overview begins with the review of non-clinical data that I just spoke about on the prior slide. And after medical experts have shown in both laboratory and animal studies that a particular treatment has a good chance of being safe in humans, as well as being either compared to or better than available treatment for people with a specific disease, they must get permission from the FDA to start the clinical trial in humans. And additionally, the FDA will conduct routine and ad hoc audits and inspections of study sites and drug manufacturers, for example, especially if there is a reason to think that proper procedures are not being followed. And if serious problems are found, the FDA can prevent that site or physician from doing any further research and can also put the trial on clinical hold. This means that patients already enrolled in the study must be taken off drug and that no further patients can be enrolled or administered the drug until or if the clinical hold is lifted by the FDA. And finally, after completion of the phase 3 trials that Pirouz just spoke about, the FDA will review all of the trials previous and the phase 3 trial and all the data, and will decide if that new treatment is safe and effective enough to be approved and go to market. Next slide. Once a study has regulatory approval, it is moved to potential sites such as your doctor's office to evaluate their ability to participate in the trial. A physician will be selected as principal investigator at each site for the study, which entails a multitude of responsibilities, which not least of which is the safety of each participant under their care. And Hillary will talk a little bit about the other ones later. Your physician and those of all the participating sites are the front line for safety reporting within the trial. The data collected and adverse events reported by the study physician is essential to ensure the safety of not just you, the individual at the site, but also for all participants within the study. And as this responsibility is great, as you can imagine, a study investigator is a physician or healthcare provider, such as a nurse practitioner, that is well qualified within the disease being studied and is trained and experienced to provide medical care to subjects enrolled in a trial. They also must be trained and understand good clinical practice, or GCP guidelines, which ensure that trials ethically operate in the rights, safety, and welfare of patients in the collection of data. So before a physician decides to participate in the study, they will carefully review the protocol to ensure the design is agreeable and does not interfere in any meaningful, significant way with the standards of care for the intended patients. And once the study physician makes the decision to proceed with the trial, there is yet again another layer of review that must take place. This time, the institutional review board at the site will provide this check and balance. Next slide. The Institutional Review Board, or IRB, is an ethics committee that is charged with protecting the rights and welfare of human subjects recruited to participate in research protocols. An IRB will be at every site and must approve every clinical trial in the US before they can be conducted at that site. The IRB reviews all clinical trials involving human subjects at that particular site and have the authority to approve, disapprove, or require modifications to the protocols before it can proceed. The IRB also bears responsibility of reviewing ongoing research to ensure continued diligence that subjects are not being placed at undue risk. The IRB is comprised of a panel of scientific and medical experts with diverse experiences in research, medicine, and ethics to ensure these critical decisions are made through a thorough and rigorous process. Additionally, IRBs may also include laypersons, such as yourself, that have the lived experience of a given disease, either personally or through a loved one. This is an extremely important perspective to have within clinical trials, as you are the expert on the day-to-day experience of living with a chronic disease and can provide valuable insights into the feasibility of study design, objectives, and procedures, for example. But the IRB review is this key step to ensuring that patients' best interests are kept at the core of clinical trials and that the safety is protected. So back to the PI, despite their buy-in, the review of the protocol and sending it to the IRB, without their approval, it doesn't matter what the PI says, a clinical trial cannot begin. The IRB will overrule that recommendation. They can withhold their approval from a trial if there are any concerns related to patient safety or trial structure, and they may do so until or if adequate changes are made that satisfy those concerns. And after a trial starts, the IRB must be updated with any changes or amendments to the study protocol, because again, that could change their mind, and will monitor the progress of the trial along the way to ensure the participants continue to have safety and are protected. Next slide. And once the study has started, medical supervision and oversight of participants is the responsibility of the study physician and the medical monitor. So first at the site level, where the study physician is going to be charged with the day-to-day management and care of every participant under their supervision. Study participants will receive careful medical attention and must be closely observed for potential safety concerns. And although your physician is expected to follow the requirements of the study protocol, sometimes, as Pirouz alluded to previously, this is not possible due to your specific medical requirements. In these situations, your care must always come first, which means that any intervention you need that ensures your well-being rises above the needs of the protocol. And depending on the situation, however, this may mean that you can no longer participate in the trial for your safety, and that's okay. Your safety and care may also be monitored by other medical professionals on the study. It is the primary duty of the study physician, but there's going to be a team around you that's also assuring your safety, such as nurses, nurse practitioners, other therapists, etc. So in other words, there will be this complete team of medical professionals and experts working together at the site to cover all aspects of your care. And second, at the sponsor level, where a medical monitor is delegated to oversee and review safety data, including all participants at all sites. So as the study physician is at your care, at your site, medical monitor, sponsor level, all patients, all sites. This allows for a holistic aggregate review of the data on an ongoing basis with the goal of recognizing any emerging potential safety signals quickly as possible. And although the medical monitor can provide guidance as it relates to the protocol, they are not responsible for the direct management of participants at the site level. And as someone who moved from the bedside as a provider to research, I have to admit that was the most challenging thing, an aspect of the transition for me. As the medical monitor, I had to remember that I was in charge of giving medical guidance related to the protocol, but not of the individual patient anymore. And this is rightfully so, as hard as it was for me. The responsibility of the study physician at the site who has examined and cared for the participant in front of them. It shouldn't be the medical monitor. Which brings me to my last slide, which will discuss the medical care and what it looks like when you are enrolled in a trial. Next slide. So typically, participants continue to see their usual healthcare providers while enrolled in a clinical trial. And while most clinical studies provide participants with medical products or interventions related to the illness or condition being studied, they do not provide extended or complete health care. This does not mean, however, that you won't have access to full medical care while in a clinical trial, because you will. And although a study's design should not interfere with your standard of care and your medical management, sometimes there are caveats to a protocol that may restrict certain medications or procedures that could negatively affect either your safety or, secondarily, the data for the study. So in these situations, your physician will need to determine if the prohibited medication or procedure provides to you needed required benefits. And if so, you may again need to be withdrawn from the study or not enrolled at all to ensure your safety and continuity of care. Other times, a study may require you to change your current therapy. For example, I was involved in a hypertension study that required participants to wean off their current antihypertensives prior to starting study medication. This was done to avoid large shifts in blood pressure that could be dangerous for the patient, but also to determine the efficacy or how well the drug worked as a standalone therapy. So as you can imagine, this may not be safe for certain patients who are either well controlled on their current regimen and don't want to change, or may have severe hypertensive episodes if taking off their medication, putting their safety at risk. In such cases, it is the responsibility of the study physician in close partnership with you to determine if you can safely adhere to the study requirements. In other words, your safety and medical care will never be influenced negatively by the protocol. So finally, sometimes an investigational drug will not be available to participants at the conclusion of the study. This can be worrisome to people, especially if the underlying disease state has been positively affected in some way. For example, your symptoms are better. This again is where your provider comes into play and has a conversation with you. Other treatment options, including resuming your prior therapy, will be discussed to minimize any potential negative effects of coming off of the study medication. So that concludes my quick overview of clinical trial safety. I hope this illuminates a bit how important safety is in clinical trials, and that there are multiple layers of regulatory, medical, and scientific experts behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and with you at the site that are present to ensure that safety is maintained in every trial. And so now I will stop talking and hand it over to my colleague Hillary to discuss the patient journey. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. So I will be wrapping up the presentation with an overview of the patient journey and what it means to the participants to take part in a clinical trial. And then we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end as well. So this shows a very high-level picture of the patient journey, starting with consenting. So as Pirouz mentioned at the beginning, all participants have a choice. It's voluntary whether or not to participate in a clinical trial, and the consenting process is that opportunity to understand the aspects of the trial and whether or not you wish to participate. Then you enter into a screening and eligibility phase, in which basically you just undergo some assessments to find out if you are a good fit, if it's safe for you, and if you meet the criteria. Then during the trial period itself, if you are eligible, you will ask to begin the treatment and go through the visits and return to the study site as dictated by the protocol. And then at the end of the study, once your last study visit has completed, you'll come off treatment and have usually you'll have a final set of assessments after study treatment. And then you'll go back to your normal care with your study physician and other staff. So the next slide, we'll get a little bit more detail into the informed consent process. So prior to joining any clinical trial, you'll be provided with an informed consent. And what that is it's a form that is just what it sounds like. It's informed because it's providing all of the information and details about the clinical trial that you need to make a choice to consent to take part in that trial. So it's called informed consent, and it really does fulfill both of those terms. So the form itself will review, like I said, all of the information and details about the study treatment itself, the study drug or other device or diagnostic that is being studied in that trial. How it will be conducted, what are the steps and the assessments that will take place during that trial, and really importantly, what is expected of you as a trial participant. How many times you have to come into the clinic, what assessments you will go through, and any sort of details that you need to understand and acknowledge. The risks of the study treatment, as well as potential benefits of the study treatment, will be reviewed, as well as your rights as a participant. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about your rights as a study participant a little bit later. But bottom line is you really must fully understand and agree to what is taking what the details and the expectations of that trial before you can participate. You don't have to agree, right? It's completely voluntary. And if you wish not to participate, your medical care will not be changed or altered in any way. Come up in all three of these sections because it really is important to understand that you're not, no one is being forced or required to participate in a clinical trial. If you do decide to join a clinical trial, you're always able to, at any time for any reason, withdraw your consent, which means you no longer have to participate in the trial and go through the study assessments, and you'll just go back to your regular medical care. Next slide. So in some cases, studies that involve minors or anyone under the age of 18, at least that's the definition of minors in the United States, I think in most states, If there are minors, there is a separate process called assent. So the informed consent still has to come from the parents or guardians that are acknowledging and agree to enroll their child in a clinical trial. In some cases, states and certain regions require assent of certain ages of children. Usually it's older children, 15 and 16 and above, must also understand the clinical trial requirements and affirm and agree that they will participate, and that is called assent. So in some cases, both agreements are required. Next slide. So a little bit more detail about the screening and eligibility process. If you do agree to participate, you will enter a screening period. And this is a time in which you'll be assessed to determine if you fit the criteria and if your participation will continue to be safe for you as a participant. So you'll have lab tests and physicals, all different assessments based on the study protocol, but again, to make sure you fit the criteria. And the reason for these eligibility criteria is to ensure that we're looking at a somewhat similar group of people, and whether it be in a condition or another aspect to be able to study and determine the goal of the trial, right? To see an effect, we have to have a somewhat similar baseline of the participants. So your doctor will review the screening data and determine if you meet the eligibility criteria based on the assessments that need to be performed, lab, physical exams, your history. And if you do not meet the eligibility criteria, then you won't join the trial and you'll just resume your normal regular care. But if you do meet them, then you'll be able to enroll into the clinical trial, and that's when you'll start the study assessments and return to your doctor or the clinic according to the protocol visits. Next slide. So treatment assignment, once you do get assigned, and this was covered a little bit before in terms of the concept of interventional trials versus observational trials. So if you are enrolled in a clinical trial, you'll begin the treatment period of the study, and you'll be assigned to a treatment. So remember, we talked about randomized, controlled trials. So you'll be randomized to the assigned treatment. Again, if it's an observational trial, there's no study treatment, and your care will just the participation in the trial will just continue as your medical care and regular assessments according to that observational trial. But most clinical trials are interventional in nature. And how you are assigned will depend on the design of the trial or how the protocol is written. Most studies, as we spoke about earlier, participants are randomized to the study treatment. So you can think of randomized as sort of a flip of a coin, and it's totally random. It's generated by a computer, so it's not influenced by any party. And you may be randomized to either an active study drug or to a placebo, a pill that looks like the study drug, but that doesn't have any active ingredients, a sugar pill, as it's sometimes called. It is important to know that you and your doctor will not know what you're assigned to. That's the blinding, and you cannot choose your assignment either, as was described earlier. Next slide. So the study visits, during the actual conduct of the study, there may be a lot of different types of visits. And once you're assigned, the protocol will determine how many times you need to come back to the doctor's office or the clinic, and what types of assessments you'll do. So there may be a hospitalization period where you stay in clinic overnight or for a couple of days, but the number of days that you need to stay in the hospital will be made clear to you at the time of consent. That's one of the many details that should be made extremely clear, and it is spelled out in the informed consent. Many trials, especially these days, are outpatient. There are a lot of trials that utilize telemedicine or virtual visits so that you don't even have to go to the study clinic or see a doctor or or make an appointment and leave your job or what have you. But for the most part, there are a series of visits that are explained in the informed consent. So you'll be able to plan those and work with your family to make those arrangements. But it is absolutely critical to maintain the schedule and to keep appointments and attend the study visits as described in the protocol and the informed consent. The study visit schedule is very critical in terms of determining the outcome and determining the answering the questions that the study protocol is setting out to answer. So in order to monitor your safety as well, there are routine visits and assessments that happen at certain periods of time throughout the study, and making those study visits and adhering to the study's visit schedule is very important for your safety, as well as for determining the effect of the study treatment and measuring that effect. During the treatment period, of course, if there are any questions or concerns that you have as a patient and questions about the treatment, you should always immediately call the study doctor. That goes back to some of the medical monitoring and opportunities that the study doctor and team have to be able to assess any risks or effects you may have. Next slide. So at the end of the study, after the final study visit, and once you are complete with your study treatment or placebo, you'll the treatment treatment period has come to an end, but there will be typically one last set of assessments, usually as a visit to confirm any physical findings or lab findings, and to check overall health and go through a checklist. It's very similar to what occurs at many assessments while you're on treatment, but this closes the loop and kind of wraps everything up at the end of the study. There are special circumstances in which the study treatment may be available through a different clinical trial, like an extension study, a registry trial that Pirouz was referencing, but those are in special circumstances, and again, those have to be approved by the FDA and go through all of those review boards. After the end of the study visit, you've completed all the requirements that you have signed up for and that you consented to as part of the clinical protocol, and you'll resume your regular medical care and discuss other options with your medical team if available. Next slide. So your rights as a participant. This is the final slide, but a very important slide for sure. While clinical trials are important to us as scientists studying the medicines and determining new therapies, it's absolutely vital to understand and remember that participation in clinical trials is always voluntary. The informed consent will review your rights and requirements as a participant. There are certain state regulations and rules that differ throughout the United States and even beyond throughout the globe, but the fundamental voluntary nature of clinical trials is global and ubiquitous. Some things to remember is that your doctor will not withhold available treatment if you decide not to participate in a clinical trial. There is no punishment for not participating in a clinical trial if your doctor is offering. You may and you should ask any questions to understand the study treatment or the clinical trial. And in fact, the informed consent is a process that should take as long as you need. If you need to take that form and the details about the trial home and discuss it with your family members, that's definitely encouraged as well. And if you do decide to participate, you can always exit at any time. There's no identifying information of any individual identifiers in a clinical trial. Everything is coded and participants participants get a number, and there's no personal information that's part of the clinical trial data. And you don't lose any legal or medical rights by participating in a clinical trial. So that's just a high-level summary of your rights as a participant in a clinical trial. But if you do ever have the opportunity, your doctor can certainly discuss that in more detail with you. But I do hope that if any of you have not had the opportunity to, that this talk gave you some insight and some shed some light on what it means to participate in clinical trials. And again, there's some great resources here. So
Thanks, Hillary.
Yeah.
Lots of good information. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And then I just want to say, Marcia and Dallas, thank you from the SAT, from Cardurion on behalf of our broader team. Thanks to you guys for inviting us, and for us to interact with the patient community is, if I've told you before, kind of brings a smile to our faces, and it's a privilege to be able to sort of at least share some of this data. If there's, or some of this information, I should say, I'm used to always saying data. If there's any questions, again, I think the NIH webpage is really good. It follows the flow of this, or our slides follow the flow of their Learn document. But if there's any questions at all, referring there, and by any means through Marcia or Alice, so you can always contact us and answer any questions if any arise from here. But if there's any, we're happy to answer those. Looks.
I put one question in here, Pirouz.
Yeah.
What happens if a participant has an adverse effect while in the study?
Really good question. So I'm going to punt this one to Liz from safety perspective. I think maybe Liz, if you can talk about a singular person, a participant, and what happens actually if you see 5, 6, 7 participants with one adverse. Kind of two ways we handle that. I think it's important to explain.
Yeah, so the first thing with the individual, if an individual has an adverse event, the most important thing that will happen is the patient will be managed. So let's just say it's, nausea, for example, or constipation or whatever the usual adverse events that we may see in clinical trials. The physician at the study level will have the responsibility of managing those patient's symptoms or anything that needs to be done testing wise, et cetera, for the patient. There may be additional tests that are required by the protocol for certain adverse events affecting the liver, for example, or kidneys, if that's something we're watching closely for a particular medication. Those will be conducted as well. But first and foremost, the patient will be managed. If these are just expected and individual adverse events that are occurring, that's one thing. But the medical monitor will also be monitoring for any safety signals that may be emerging, which means there's clustering of specific adverse events that are occurring. For example, kidney injury. Are we seeing that sort of, we call it a signal, a safety signal across all of the sites and patients that are in a particular study? Because remember, the PI can only see what he sees or she sees in front of them. We see all of the data. So we're always looking for those signals that may emerge. And if we do see a significant safety signal that is not of an acceptable safety parameter for the study or for the patients, we may have to stop the study altogether and investigate further. And the study may have to be terminated if the worst case scenario. Did I cover everything first?
No, you cover everything. And I think just two other things to highlight. I think if in an individual case, remember your physician manages your care. And so if we think the adverse, if the PI, the study physician, your doctor thinks your adverse effect is significant or severe enough, they'll stop the study drug and manage you accordingly. The other aspect is if we find that multiple people have an effect, we are obligated to report this to IRBs, to federal authorities. And so it's not just us that house that data. We see a signal, everyone knows that there's a signal. We don't necessarily just get to hold that information ourselves. And sometimes we may think it's okay to run the trial because we understand why the effect is there. We tell others because others may come back and say, no, we don't think so. You're going to pause the study until you do maybe an extra lab test, or maybe you reduce the dose, but there could be some form of modification to the protocol, hopefully before we terminate the protocol. But sometimes, yes, if there's an unseen event, then you'll stop the protocol because, again, safety comes first.
Yeah.
Another question. So if I participate in a trial, will I be given results of the tests that are performed, for example, an EKG? The answer is yes, within there's one caveat. If a study is blinded, meaning that we don't know which arm you're on, if you're on treatment or if you're not on treatment, if that result indicates which one you're on, we may not be able to provide that to you until the end of the study, because then we would unblind you. Meaning, let's say you took a drug that reduced your sugar, your glucose. If all of a sudden your glucose is very high, 500 the day before the trial, and then the day after the trial, your sugar is now 100, guess what? You're probably on my drug. So for things like that that are very obvious, we call them blinded results. Even I don't get to see those until the end of the trial. If there's a safety concern around that, we have unblinded people that look at the data separate from the study team for monitoring, but you, me, we wouldn't see that until the end of the study. At the end of the study, it's like a medical chart. Your results, they're yours. You get access to them, and your doctor will explain to them, just like any clinical lab test you may get in routine care. That's a good question.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions to post? Okay. Well, I think I want to thank you, Pirouz, Liz, and Hillary, for a fabulous orientation of clinical trials and lots of comprehensive information. So we appreciate that. And I want to thank all of the families that have joined us tonight and remind you of a couple of webinars coming up this week. Tomorrow evening, Tuesday evening, the 27th, we have our ARVC progression and heart transplant webinar that is will be hosted with 3 individuals, all affected by ARVC, and each received a heart transplant. So you'll get to hear their heart journeys. And then Thursday, we have gene therapy basics, and it will start 30 minutes earlier than this one. So at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you all for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.